I'm Ryan White of Rooted in Torah Ministries. This week we're going over the Torah portion Toldot, which is Genesis 25 verse 19 through 28 verse 9. And this is another very packed Torah portion, a lot of great stuff to look at here. And we're going to see that this Torah portion begins with the Toldot, the generation, the genealogy. That's what Toldot is the genealogy of Isaac, the son of Abraham, right? And so we kind of see what's going on in the life of Abraham. Now it's interesting because this idea of beginning with a Toldot, with a generations, also extends forward into the New Testament, into the apostolic writings, because the book of Matthew actually begins with a Toldot. It says in Matthew 1, it says the book of, and in our English translation, the genealogy of Yeshua the Messiah. But in the Greek text, if we actually went back to and looked at the Greek, what it says is, it says, Biblos Genesos Iesu Christou. And that concept of Biblos Genesos is actually the same formula that we find, for example, in Genesis 2, verse 4. This is the book of the generations of the heavens and the earth. In Genesis 5, the book of the generations, right? And here again with Isaac, we have this concept of the Toldot, or if we were to look at the Septuagint, I'm going to pull this up really fast here because I forgot to actually verify this, but I'm gonna put my money on this actually using the same. Here it is. I'll put this up here on the screen for you. We have here, and you can see this at the bottom highlighted here, hopefully, for you. It says, these are the Genesis, which is where we get our word Genesos from in the book of Matthew. These are the Genesis of Isaac, or the generations. That's what the concept of Genesis means, is this idea of the beginnings, or the origins. So this is another origin story that we're dealing with here. So it's kind of interesting that that's going to tie in with Yeshua, because here we have Rebecca, who has a miraculous birth, just like the mother of Yeshua, Mary, has a miraculous birth at the beginning of the Genesis, the book of Genesis of Yeshua the Messiah, right? Okay, so let's start off. Let's not forget to bless our Creator, who has blessed us with this week's Torah portion. Amen. All right. Baruch et Adonai Hamvarak, Baruch Adonai Hamvarak leolam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher bakar banu mikol ha'amim ve'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen. Amen. All right. So we have this tying in again of this Toldot, this connecting point between the creation of the world. We've got in Genesis 5, we have the generations of Adam, and of course we have Yeshua, the generations of Yeshua, or the genealogy of Yeshua, if we can say the same thing here. And so it's tied in with this little text here about Isaac praying to the Lord. So let's turn here. Okay, it says here, starting verse 20, and Isaac was 40 years old, and he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord on her behalf because she was barren. And the Lord answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Okay, so let's take a couple minutes talking about this miraculous conception, okay? We've already had one instance of this occur. We had Sarah, who was advanced in age. She, as Paul says later on in Galatians, I believe it is, she had a dead womb, right? And so the idea of God bringing forth life from a dead womb is, in fact, a shadow picture of resurrection. Here we have Isaac's wife, Rebekah, being barren. Well, she's not said to be advanced in age. In fact, at this point, Isaac's 40 years old. In that day and time, Rebecca probably would have been 10 years younger, maybe even younger than that. But we know that she is younger, right? She's young, and yet she's barren, and so her womb is not dead because of advanced age. It's just that she was born this way. She's born with chaos in her life, because for a woman in the ancient Near Eastern world, their source of honor came from, one of their main sources of honor, should I say, came from their ability to bear children. And so this is something extremely hard. We see the same thing with Hannah. If you remember Hannah, when she was married to Elkanah, right? This is in 1 Samuel, and she was barren too, and yet his other wife was producing children, and so it became a source of shame for her. We also see this with Leah and Rachel. They are having a birthing competition, and Jacob's like, I got babies everywhere, right? But it all stems from their competition to produce more children than the other, because that is their source of honor. And so Isaac is praying not only for an heir from the Lord, but he's also praying on behalf of his wife to restore her honor. And so, it says here that the Lord answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So this is our second of the miraculous births that occur in the Bible. So and let's go through and let's name some of them. We've got Sarah, we've got Rebekah, we've actually got Rachel. If you remember, she was praying for that, and she had what we call a miraculous birth. I'm going to throw out there that Moses was a miraculous birth as well. Now, we don't have any indication that his mother was barren by any means and that the Lord had to open up her womb. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying was miraculous was that he should have died. I mean, Pharaoh's army was going around and basically killing all of the Hebrew infant boys at this time. And so the fact that he survives, even though it's not because of a closed womb, we actually see that shadow picture there with him being put into an ark, and if you will, into a basket and put in water. So you've got kind of like the placenta that the child is in, and he's in the water. The placenta is in the water. So this is all this picture I'm going to propose to you of a miraculous birth, even though in that case the Lord did not open the womb. But we can still add that picture to the miraculous birth. And then, of course, we've got Hannah. And Hannah, who does she give birth to? She gives birth to the prophet Samuel. Samuel is extremely important. Why? Because he is the one who anoints the first king of Israel. He anoints David as king of Israel as well. So, who are the products of this? We've got Isaac, who is obviously, he's the child of promise for Abraham. Then we've got Joseph, who is the one who ends up saving his family from and really we've got we'll talk about this when we get to it, we've got a huge shadow picture of Yeshua in the life of Joseph, right? Because Joseph is rejected by his brothers. He's put into a place where he's essentially dead to them, and then he's, if you will, raised up, not literally raised from the dead, but he's figuratively raised up to the right hand of Pharaoh, second in command, just like Yeshua is raised up to the right hand of the Father, right? So Joseph is extremely important in saving Israel. Moses, obviously, he's the leader of the Exodus, and Samuel is the one who brings about the kingship in Israel. So each of these cases, as you see here, the miraculous birth, and this is where sometimes, because of our history as believers in Yeshua, because of our history in the 3rd and 4th century, really in the 4th century AD, we had a group of Christians popped up who were called the Gnostics. And the Gnostics denied the divinity of Yeshua. They said he was just a man. He was not the Son of God. He was not divine by any means. And they really focused in on the virgin birth, and they said it was a complete lie. It was not true. Okay? So, keep that in mind. That is why our focus on the virgin birth has really come down to whether or not it was God, and that's one of the things, that's why we've so emphasized it had to be the virgin birth, and we focus so much on the virgin birth itself that we really haven't understand the true purpose of the virgin birth. The true purpose of the virgin birth was not about God just performing a miracle in order to perform a miracle. Just like the purpose of him opening Sarah's womb wasn't just to show Abraham that he had power. Him saving Moses was not so that he could show his power over Pharaoh. In each of these cases, the person who is born from a miraculous birth, whether that is from the opening of a barren womb, the livening of a dead womb, the protection from Pharaoh, or in Yeshua's case, the miraculous birth of Yeshua from a virgin. In each of these cases, the miraculous birth is not the point. It's important because it's the sign that the one proceeding forth from that womb is extremely important to Israel's history. Are you following along with me here? Right? The birth of Yeshua miraculously through a virgin is a sign to Israel that God is about to do miraculous things through this person of Yeshua. It was the same thing, because remember, after the virgin birth, what do? They quote Isaiah 7, verse 14, a virgin shall conceive. And the interesting thing is if you read Isaiah 8 provides the fulfillment of Isaiah 7, sure, but in reality, we've got to realize biblical prophecy is not something that is one-time event occurring, right? It's something that is a recurring pattern. And really, when we study the prophecies concerning Yeshua, there's a lot of times where we see an initial fulfillment in the days of whatever prophet makes that. Or, Yeshua or Matthew also says that Yeshua had to go to Egypt and then come back so that the prophecy could be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. Well, that was fulfilled with Israel being called out of Egypt. That's what Hosea is talking about. But we got to realize that there's the type, or the shadow, should I say, fulfillment, and then there's the true fulfillment in Yeshua. Are you on board with me? Okay, and please don't consider me to be a heretic for this, right? So in Isaiah's time frame, he said to have this prophecy that a young woman will conceive and bear a son, and he will call his name Emmanuel. And so in chapter 8, what do we have? His wife conceives and bears a son, and they don't name him Emmanuel. They name him Mahel, something like a huge name, right? Because we're missing the point here. It's not about being named Emmanuel. Just like when Matthew quotes it, his audience didn't go, well, why didn't they name him Emmanuel? Wait a minute. Maybe that's his middle name. Maybe he's Jesus Emmanuel Christ. Right? No, that's not what his audience is thinking. The idea of you shall call his name, being called the name, doesn't necessarily mean that someone literally calls you that. It's not about pronunciation. It's not about actually being called that. It's about that authority and what that name means. What does Emmanuel mean? Matthew explains this to us. Emmanuel means God is with us. So the prophecy in Isaiah being fulfilled with Emmanuel in chapter 8 is about this. The young maiden conceiving is a signpost pointing to the fact that God is with us. The same thing in Matthew's gospel. The virgin birth is miraculous, no doubt, but the point of that is not that God can perform miracles. God can do all sorts of wonderful miracles. The point of that birth specifically is to point that in Yeshua, God is with us. Yeshua is the coming of the Lord to Zion, the thing that they had been waiting for. You got to realize that in the first century, they believed themselves to be in a state of exile still. I've got some teachings on the website, rootedintorah.com, that talk about that, and we just don't have time to really go into this. But they believed themselves to be in exile. Not in geographical exile, because they were in the land, but in political and theological exile. They were in political exile because foreign nations still controlled them, and they were in theological exile because the presence of God had not returned to Zion. And now the virgin birth is a signpost pointing to Emmanuel, God with us. This, in Yeshua, you are seeing the presence of God return to Zion. You see, we're still accepting the virgin birth. We're still accepting the divinity of Yeshua, but we're putting it into its proper context of sign pointing to the greater thing. Now, going back to our Torah portion, because we've just turned a whole, one verse into 10 minutes of teaching here. Going back to our Torah portion, again, this barrenness is a sign pointing to something miraculous happening in God's history of the salvation of humanity. That's what I'm going to propose to you. So, with this in mind, we've got now Rebecca is pregnant. And we go to our text here, and it says, the children struggled within her. And she said, well, if it is so, why is it? And she inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, this is key here, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 people will be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Why is that significant? Well, because this is showing that even from physical descendancy from the patriarchs, from Abraham and Isaac, just because you're physically descended does not necessarily mean that you have it all, right? It says, the stronger, 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older, the one who seems to have it all, will actually serve the younger. This is a concept that we see throughout the biblical history, that God is not concerned with your idea that you have the right to be in the covenant because of your birth. God does not want a people who have entitlement to something. God is seeking a people who have a heart for him. And the people who have a heart for him, interestingly enough, tend to be the people who mess up pretty bad. Think about King Saul versus King David. Who committed more heinous crimes? King David did by far. I mean, he committed adultery, and then he killed the husband of the woman he committed adultery with. And yet, David was a king after God's own heart. You see, for David messed up, but he had a whole and complete heart for God. Even though he messed up, it was his heart that mattered. It's because he really desired to be God's king. He desired to be with God. He let God fill him, even as an imperfect vessel. And we see that playing out in the Torah portion. Esau, he's a skillful hunter. He's a man of the field. He was red. By the way, if you go back to ancient Near Eastern iconography, whenever a statue or a portrait of someone is red, that means that they have honor. Right? So this is someone that people looked up to, that people wanted, kind of like Saul. Saul was the person that people looked up to, that he was the king that the people desired even, right? They wanted Saul. And yet I'm going to propose to you that Saul had a heart like Esau. Because we look at Esau, and Isaac loved Esau, but Esau didn't really love God. We see him coming in from the field, and he's willing to sell his birthright. And remember that the birthright, the inheritance, this is what connects him to the covenant. This is what connects him to God. And for him, it's just, well, who cares? I'm hungry. I'd rather serve my stomach than serve God. And so we see that concept of these 2 nations struggling, the younger and the older, and we see in that picture of some people who it's just about their belly. It's just about being big and strong and people looking up to them. We see a shadow picture of the Pharisees who would elongate and I realize that we're not talking about every single Pharisee, but there were groups within the Pharisees. They would elongate their seat. They would, call attention to themselves. They'd stand in the middle of the road and give these wonderful, beautiful prayers. But Yeshua calls them whitewashed sepulchres. On the outside, they look wonderful, just like Esau looked wonderful, but on the inside, they're dead. They're just serving themselves. These are the older who will end up serving the younger, the one who messes up but has a heart for the Lord. And we see this. Esau certainly is no saint, and Esau does not have a heart for the Lord. Jacob does have a heart for the Lord, but man, does he mess up. Let's look at this. We talked about in the last couple Torah portions about God calling Israel to be a nation doing righteousness and justice, right? Consider this. Jacob is sitting there. He by now probably knew the story about how God called Abraham and Isaac and himself to be the people who do righteousness and justice. And he's sitting there making food, thinking about it, and in comes his brother, starving. And what does he do? Does he help out someone who is hungry? Does he feed the hungry? No. He goes, this is time for me to make some money. Right? Jacob takes advantage of a hungry person. And we see what transpires, right? He gets sold the birthright, and we're told even that Esau despised the birthright. And so Esau has no heart for God, but Jacob sure does not do the right thing. He messes up. And then we kind of have this little insert here in chapter 26 where Isaac settles in Gerar, and he kind of has this whole little thing going on, just like Abraham did with the other king wanting the sister. But I want to go kind of skip over that for our time being here and look at what happens in chapter 27 when Isaac gets older, right? Isaac is old, and they're going to now do the blessing over them. And this blessing is extremely important because this passes along, if you will, the mantle of authority, at least in Isaac's mind. Now, had Isaac given the blessing to Esau, would that have really changed God's plans for Jacob? I don't think so. But it's interesting, again, we've got Isaac making some bad mistake or bad choices here. He loves his oldest son because his oldest son is the one that really, externally looks good. He's the big, proud hunter. He's the guy who's just makes his daddy proud. Jacob, rather than maybe going in and having a conversation with his father about the heart of Esau, he does the same thing. He takes advantage of a situation. It says that Isaac was old and that his eyes were too dim to see. Now, we kind of get the sense, too, that it wasn't just that his eyes were dim, that his other senses were dim as well. I mean, he probably had lost his sense of taste because he mistakes goat meat for venison, right? He fills a goat fur that's on his son and thinks that it's the hairiness of Esau. And as hairy as Esau may have been, I have a hard time believing that he actually felt like a goat. So he must have had some diminished sensation there for sure. But he does, and it's kind of interesting, he does actually, his hearing appears to be good because he can actually pick out that it's not the voice of Esau, but because of his other senses were dull and he didn't recognize this, Jacob is able to trick him. So once again, Jacob, first time he took advantage of someone who's hungry. Now he's taking advantage of a blind person. He's taking advantage of his father in this situation. And so ultimately it comes along and we see the blessing given. And of course, I do believe that this is the Lord's will by all means, but looking at it from that other perspective, Jacob is not acting with righteousness and justice, taking advantage of the hungry and taking advantage of the blind. And I'm going to propose to you that in this sense, Jacob is living out a shadow picture of Israel. And I believe that each of the three patriarchs actually live out a shadow picture of Israel. We've got Abraham, right? He's the one who receives the covenant promise. And it's interesting that when he goes down to Egypt, if you actually read the text carefully, when Pharaoh takes his wife and then the bad stuff happens, what happens when Pharaoh takes his wife and what does the Lord do? He creates plagues. And so we have a shadow picture of Israel in Egypt and God rescuing them with plagues and coming out. So Abraham kind of represents Israel in Egypt and the exodus from Egypt and coming to the land and purchasing land, as we talked about, getting a foothold in the land. And then we go to Isaac. Isaac is not allowed to leave the land. Isaac only has one wife rather than being a polygamist. Isaac represents Israel in the land during that time period where Israel is supposed to be faithful, one wife. You get it? The faithful Israel in the land. But then Jacob, he now becomes this shadow picture of what happens to Israel later on, where he takes on two wives. Right? We see this Israel would go after the Lord and the Asherahs. And then with that, then you got concubines. So in addition to taking on another marriage partner, now we've got other wives coming in the picture. And so we've got this unfaithfulness here. We've got another thing. Not only was Israel unfaithful with idolatry, but they were very oppressive to the poor and to the disadvantaged, right? Just like Jacob is doing that to his hungry brother and to his blind father. And as a result of that, Israel is sent where? Into exile. What happens to Jacob? Jacob, too, gets sent into exile. He must flee. Now, he doesn't get taken captive, but he must flee from his brother Esau and ends up in exile in the company of Laban for 20 years. So we see these shadow pictures of what's going to happen to Israel being played out in the lives of the patriarchs. So I hope this is all kind of making sense and all coming together. Let's finish up by blessing our Creator, who has blessed us with this week's wonderful Torah portion. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan לנו תורת אמת וחלם נטע בתוכנו. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha-Torah. Amen and amen. I hope you enjoyed it. May God bless you and keep you. We'll see you again next week. Shalom, everyone.